Bueno, buenos días. Esta es la segunda charla de las sesiones de verano del Seminario Permanente de Filosofía. Nuestro ponente de turno es Ted Sider. El profesor Ted Sider es profesor en Rutgers University y anteriormente ha sido profesor en New York University y Cornell University, entre otros. Ha escrito numerosos libros en lógica, metafísica y filosofía del tiempo, entre los cuales están Lógica para la filosofía, Escribiendo el libro del mundo, Las herramientas de la metafísica y la metafísica de la ciencia y Acertijos de la existencia, entre otros. Cabe resaltar que tendremos un sorteo de la versión en español del último libro al final de la charla, así que si quieren tenerlo, por favor, quédense. Y bueno, aparte de esto, Ted ha escrito numerosos artículos y dado numerosas charlas en los temas ya mencionados, que son metafísica, filosofía del tiempo y lógica. Antes de pasar a la charla directamente, Andrés les va a explicar un poco de la dinámica que esta charla va a tener.
Bien, sí. Vamos a tener preguntas, por supuesto, abierto a todos los participantes al final de la charla. No vamos a emplear la opción electrónica de levantar la mano en Zoom, para los que están en Zoom, sino quienes están en Zoom y quieran preguntar al final, me pueden mandar un mensaje directamente a mí con la pregunta y yo los pongo en un orden de espera para que llegue su turno. Durante la charla, los miembros del teorema que estamos acá en el Zoom, algunos vamos a hacer preguntas sobre todo aclaratorias de lo que nos parezca pertinente. Entonces, esa es la dinámica para preguntas aclaratorias de miembros del teorema durante la charla, y luego todos los que están en Zoom pueden hacer preguntas siempre y cuando me escriban directamente a mí con su pregunta para que yo los ponga en orden. Al final vamos a tener unos 20 minutos finales de preguntas. Con eso podemos empezar. So, Professor Sider, we are ready to begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Let me get my slides pulled up. Let's see here. Okay, do you see Dasgupta's detonation slide? Great. So I want to talk about a very interesting argument made by Shamik Dasgupta that threatens all sorts of kinds of realism. So to begin with, I want to start talking about the idea of natural kinds. So imagine a universe that's very simple, just completely full of fluid, and there's a plane that divides the universe into two halves. One half where the fluid is uniformly red, and the other half in which the fluid is uniformly blue. It doesn't matter that I'm talking about colors here. You could matter of a certain kind, matter of a certain other kind. Now imagine a group of people who encounter this universe, but don't think of the red-blue plane as being particularly significant. And instead, they think of the universe as being divided by this diagonal plane. And they treat everything on the left side of the diagonal plane as being alike and being different from everything on the right-hand side of the diagonal plane. So they've got, instead of words for red and blue, let's say they've got words for bread and roux. Now, the people who use this language might not be making any false claims at all. They don't think about red and blue. They don't have words for red and blue, so they don't misattribute red and blue to any particular region of the liquid. And when they call something bread or roux, it really is bread or roux. So they might accurately employ their concepts. But nevertheless, there seems to be something strange about this group. They're, for example, lumping together the red bit of the left-hand side of the plane with the blue bit. And those don't seem like they're alike, yet they're treating them as alike. So to further hone in on this particular kind of puzzlement here, imagine three objects, 2 electrons and a cow. So we ordinarily think you should group some of these objects together. You should group the electrons together with each other and not with the cow. the electrons go together. They don't go with the cow. The electrons are similar to each other, and they're not similar to the cow. It would make sense to have a word that applies to both of them, not a word that applies to one of the electrons in the cow and not to the other electrons. So we could imagine, though, a group of other people making this other division, and them thinking of the left electron as being like the cow, similar to the cow, going together with the cow, should be classified together with the cow, and neither with the other electron. So what should we say about this or the first kind of bizarre classification scheme? So you might think, well, the problem with the second classification is that it's grouping together the left electron and the cow, but they don't share any properties in common. But that's not true. They do share plenty of properties in common. Like they each have the property of being either an electron or a cow. Maybe they're both in Australia, in which case they have the property of being in Australia. And you might say, okay, well, I don't like the idea that the two electrons are not grouped together because they share all of their properties. But that's not true either. They don't share all their properties. Like maybe one of them has the property of being part of a cat and the other one doesn't have that property. Or maybe the one is in Australia and the other isn't. And you might say, okay, the electrons, they have more properties in common than either of them do with the cow. But that's not right either. They have infinitely many properties in common and differ with respect to infinitely many properties. I mean, you can just cook up properties like that. Like the electron and the cow, let's say they're both in Australia and the other, the right-hand electron isn't in Australia. Well, then the electron and the cow each have the property being in Australia and being less than 2,000 kilograms, and being in Australia and being less than 2,001 kilograms, and so on. And you can play the same trick with properties that they differ over. And so the number of properties shared is going to be the same in all the cases. Any two objects share infinitely many properties and differ with respect to infinitely many properties. That is on a very broad conception of properties, where there are such properties as being either an electron or a cow. But what we want to say is, well, just some of them don't count when it comes to deciding whether things are genuinely similar. So like being a cow, being an electron, those do count. Being either an electron or cow, or being in Australia, don't count. And the traditional word for the properties that do count are natural kinds, and the others are not natural kinds. So the notion of natural kind is going to be important in our discussion here. Now, I'm actually going to be using the term natural property instead of natural kind or naturalness as a word for this elite status that some properties have and some don't. So this is a term from David Lewis. He prefers that term for one reason, because the notion of naturalness, distinguishing the kinds that do count for similarity and the kinds that don't, like the distinction between properties that seem really there in the world and those that seem just kind of cooked up. That distinction also applies to relations as well. So you could talk about the relation of being 5 feet from each other, which seems like one of the genuine relations, versus being either 5 feet from or being 6 within common. The one is closer to a square than the other is, or something like that. You can have cooked up relations as well. And natural kind suggests property, doesn't feel apt to use that term in connection with relations. So we'll say natural properties, but that can include the notion of naturalness can also be applied to relations. So natural properties and natural relations. So this distinction, and by the way, as we said initially, just jump right in if you have a question. That's perfectly fine with me. Just interrupt me. Otherwise, I'll probably just talk a wall of words at you, and you won't feel like you can get in a word edgewise. Just talk, and I'll hear you. So Lewis thought that this distinction between natural properties and properties that aren't natural was really significant. And after he started thinking in these terms in the early 1980s, it then pervaded all of his thought, especially his metaphysical thought. It's the kind of notion that once you are alive to the distinction, you can see it popping up everywhere, and it really, I think, matters a ton to a lot in metaphysics and indeed throughout philosophy. We've been talking about one area in which this does matter, namely to understanding the notion of similarity. Let me mention one more, the significance of naturalness to the laws of nature and causation and the aims of science. So this is a picture of David Hume. So Hume famously said, if you think of what you think of as a causal sequence, like a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball or a rock smashing a window, you inspect your ideas and you never come across an idea of causation. You just come across constant conjunction. You see, every time you see a ball hit another ball, you always see the other ball move off, but you don't see like a little arrow of causation there. Now, this, of course, it's very controversial how to understand, how to think of exactly what Hume thought about the nature of causation. There's some people think that Hume actually was quite a realist about causation, but there's what is often thought of as a Hume or Hume-inspired theory of causation, and I'm just calling it the Humean theory of causation, is the theory, and it's a reductive theory of causation. It's that what it is for one event to cause another is just for it to be true that, in fact, every event that is like the first is preceded by an event that is like the second. So this is a reductionist view of causation because it says that causation is nothing over and above the facts about what actually happens. There's no super added feature of causation in addition to just the fact that in the actual world, whenever you get this, you get that. So modern Humean theories of laws of nature are in the same spirit. So according to these theories, the fact that there is a law of nature that the force equals mass times the acceleration, or whatever other law of nature you like from a more up-to-date physics. Laws of nature are nothing over and above patterns, global patterns, in what actually happens. So there's no further metaphysical glue holding the world together. There's just laws of nature just are these patterns. So a very simplistic, simple view of this sort is what I'm calling the simple Humean theory of laws on the slide. And it just says, for what it takes for a regularity, all F's are G's, to be a law, what it takes for there to be a law that all F's are G's, is just for all F's are G's to be something that holds globally throughout time and space. It everywhere and everywhen is the case that all F's are in fact G's. There's no further metaphysical glue connecting Fness to G-ness. So both of these theories need a ton of refinement, and if you delve into the metaphysics literature of the last 50 years or 60 years on causation and laws, you will find more sophisticated versions of these theories, lots of bells and whistles. But the sort of what makes them reductionist, and the thing I'm going to say next, is also true of the more sophisticated theories. So I'll stick with the simplistic ones. I mean, they really are too simplistic. They don't work for lots of reasons, but for reasons that won't affect us. So each of these Humean approaches needs the notion of natural properties to get off the ground, to even have a hope of working. So take the theory of causation. One event causes another if anything like the first is preceded by an event like the second. Well, like in what respect? We better not count a hurricane as being like a striking of a match when we're trying to evaluate whether every event like a striking of a match is followed by a lighting of the match. Better not count hurricanes as being like the striking of matches just because the hurricane and the striking are both either hurricanes or striking. So if you think of likeness as just sharing properties, that's going to be trivialized. Everything's like everything else. As for the Humean theory of laws of nature, this is a familiar argument, a kind of example from the literature on laws of nature. let's suppose it just so happens that nobody who is in on this Zoom is wearing a green shirt. I can't see anybody wearing a green shirt, although that people don't have their cameras on, but let's pretend that's true. And now let's let the predicate F stand for a very specific microphysical predicate that exactly specifies our bodies. So like it could be, F could be, take a predicate exactly saying my exact shape, and then take the, and for each of you, consider a similar such predicate and then disjoin them. So we have either being exactly this shape or that shape or that shape. And if we're specific enough, presumably there's no one else in the history of the universe that has exactly those shapes. Let's say exactly this instant in our Zoom. So then the regularity, it's a regularity that holds across all time and space. Every group of people with that property F is such that no one is wearing a green shirt in that group. Anybody with property F is wearing a non-green shirt. Clearly, though, not a law of nature. It's just an accident that none of us was wearing, that nobody with that shape is wearing a green shirt. And so it seems like both Hume's theory of causation, the Humean theory of causation and the Humean theory of laws need something like a distinction between natural properties and unnatural properties. The theory of causation to single out the correct notion of likeness, and the theory of laws because we should restrict the predicates that occur in the regularities in question to predicates for natural properties and relations. More sophisticated approaches to laws along the lines of that simple one incorporate some such restriction.
I have a question about that.
Yeah,
wouldn't we just also say like that what is required is just a notion of objective likeness? Because I mean, likeness would do for the human theory of causation because we just use the word like, and then we could say something like a law of nature is just a regularity of the form all F's are G's, where the F's are alike to each other and the G's are also alike to each other or something like that.
Right. I think there is a question about how far you could get with a notion of likeness. There's a lot to be said here. There is a tradition of trying to of beginning with the notion of similarity and then recovering a notion of natural property. It's kind of tricky. There might be some accidental it might just happen to be that a property is not natural, but it's piggybacking on a natural property. It's co-instantiated with it everywhere in our world. And you wouldn't see the difference between the two properties if you just looked at likeness. Lewis talks about some ways of doing it where you talk about all possible objects. And there are still some problems. There's, I don't remember the details, but there's a bunch of stuff in Nelson Goodman about this because Goodman thought a lot about how to, about the role of similarity in philosophy. So I think there is an interesting project there. It would be an interesting question about whether the suggestions you made work. I'm guessing they wouldn't. I guess the question is, if you have more complex laws that don't have the form all F's or G's, but like say complicated differential equations from physics or something like that, the elements in the equation might stand for natural properties or relations, but it might not be that when you just look at, there might not be anything like an antecedent and a consequent, or even when there is, it might not be that things that satisfy the antecedent are particularly like things that satisfy the consequent, but the law still is built up of natural properties and relations. So anyway, I don't think that's anything like I mean, I think you'd have to look at some details, but that would be my place to look for concerns about that kind of approach. But very much it should be very much on the table. We have the following idea. We've got a certain kind of work we want this notion of natural properties to do. In fact, Lewis's most famous paper about this topic was called New Work for a Theory of Universals. And Lewis was thinking that this distinction between natural and unnatural properties could be made in a few different ways. And one would be in terms of a primitive notion of similarity, but a bunch of tricky stuff that he talked about. And you might be interested in looking at that. It is interesting to think about. Another was he thought there might be a room here for defining natural properties in terms of a notion of universal, the traditional notion of universals. And there might be yet other, I mean, there are some people thought, well, maybe we should have a primitive notion of lawhood and then try to recover the natural properties as the properties that occur in laws in some sense. I'm thinking of all these as views in the vicinity of one another, and they're all views that would be targeted by Dasgupta's argument. Good. So the big picture thing here is that Lewis is thinking of the notion of similarity, the notion of a law of nature, the notion of a cause, as all being defined in terms of naturalness. It's all being defined in terms of the distinction between natural and unnatural properties. And in fact, he thinks of a whole bunch of other things as being best theorized in terms of naturalness. In fact, that's his argument for accepting this distinction. Now, it's not just that he accepts the distinction between natural and unnatural properties. He also thinks of it as an objective distinction. He thinks that it's just part of the world out there, that there's this objective distinction between natural and unnatural properties. The foil here is Nelson Goodman, who thinks of Goodman agrees there's a kind of difference between bread and roux and red and blue, or the grouping that puts the cow together with one of the electrons, or in his famous example, grue and bleen versus green and blue. But Goodman thinks of this as not being an objective matter. Rather, Goodman says some predicates are entrenched in our language and culture. We're used to using those predicates. Perhaps even there's something in our biology or evolutionary history that that explains why we use these predicates. But it doesn't go any deeper than that. It's not built into the world. It comes from us, the distinction between natural and unnatural or non-natural properties. So for Lewis, on the other hand, naturalness is not tied to any particular conceptual scheme or language or group of thinkers. So the setup here is realism about natural properties, naturalness, and I'm taking that to mean the view that there is this distinction. It's important to various things such as laws and similarity and others, and it's an objective distinction in opposition to someone like Goodman. So now enter Dasgupta and also some random mystery person in the best photo I could find of him online. Dasgupta, in a wonderful paper from just a few years ago called Realism in the Absence of Value, has argued that Goodman was right about the notion of natural and non-natural properties. And in fact, Dasgupta has used this to argue for a pretty broad-reaching kind of anti-realism. The view that much of what scientific realists or realists think about as being out there in the world is really just a projection of our conceptual scheme. So what Dasgupta is attacking is not so much the distinction between natural and unnatural properties, but that it's objective. And here is his main argument. He says that naturalness is objective only if it has a certain kind of objective value. So realism about naturalness requires realism about its value. And then he says, but it can't have that objective value because there's no adequate explanation we could give about where that value comes from. Okay, so realism about naturalness requires realism about its value. Realism about its value is untenable. So what is this idea of naturalness having a certain kind of value? Well, this is a claim that I've defended in a book from around 10 years ago called Writing the Book of the World. So my core thought is that if you go back to the red-blue world and the people who categorize the world in terms of the diagonal plane rather than the plane between the red and the blue sides, there is something epistemically wrong with that conceptual scheme and people that think in terms of it. They're wrong as inquirers. Even though they don't say anything false, they're getting their beliefs don't match the world. That's the intuitive idea. They're missing out on something. If you theorize, to take a slightly different example, you theorize about the world in terms of charge and mass or wave function values or whatever, and you state laws, if we distinguish that group of people versus another group of people who theorize in terms of a bizarre conceptual scheme, in terms of schmarge and schmass or schmave function values, there's something wrong about the second group, even if they don't say anything false. They're thinking about just a different subject matter, but the subject matter of charge and mass is a better subject matter. There's something epistemically mandatory of thinking about that subject matter. And not that there's nothing good going on epistemically with the second group. There's the epistemic value, the way I'm thinking of it, is multifaceted, multidimensional, and we can evaluate people and beliefs along many different dimensions. But there is a dimension on which one can be going wrong, even if you don't say, even if one isn't saying anything false. The goal of science is to figure out what the laws are, and a group of people who don't think in terms of laws, but rather think in terms of schmlaws, which are simple regularities in the schmattural properties, where things like schmarge and schmass are schmattural properties, not natural properties. So you do everything I was doing earlier with laws, but in terms of schmatturalness, and there are schmlaws. If those scientists in this other, imagined other linguistic community are aiming for schmlaws, they're getting at what they're aiming for. But I'm thinking that there's something wrong about the aim. And there's a kind of epistemic failure there. So all these things would need to be sharpened, but let's, for these purposes, the sharpening doesn't matter. Let's just give a name to this idea in pretty broad strokes. I'm thinking that there is this epistemic requirement to theorize in terms of natural properties. There is an epistemic value to theorizing in terms of natural properties. And there's some defect if you don't. Now, Dasgupta agrees with this. He thinks that there's something wrong. We would judge the people who are aiming at schmlaws as wrong. In fact, he would say that there's something wrong with that. They're missing out on something. But he thinks of that value as being non-objective. He thinks of that as just being reflecting our notion of naturalness. And the other people would say, yeah, what you're doing is wrong to us. They would mean something a little different, and that's just fine too. Dasgupta, though, thinks the following: if, like I do, and like Lewis does, if you think that the natural, non-natural distinction is objective, you really ought to think that the value of naturalness must also be objective. Because think of it this way, if there just isn't any reason to care other than that, given what the conceptual scheme has been, that has been entrenched in us, whether through history or through evolution, if there's no reason to care other than we just happen to think in this way about this distinction, then what's the point of the distinction? You might as well just be a Goodmanian all the way and not bring in this bit of inflationary metaphysics if it's entirely optional to think in terms of naturalness and in terms of laws, and in terms of causation and all that. And I think he's right about that. I think that the person who believes in the objectivity of naturalness really does need to regard the value of naturalness as being part of the package, and that being objective as well. Though I think some people would disagree there, but I'm going to go along with that bit of Dasgupta's argument. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just a clarification about the way you and Dasgupta are using value here, because it seems to be very like inflationary with respect to what value is, and I was wondering whether you are assuming some kind of realism about normativity or epistemic normativity at least, or whether this is compatible with any kind of attitude we might have towards that.
That's a great question. I'm actually going to touch on that a little later, but it's worth talking about right now. I am not thinking of I'm a kind of naturalist about the kind of value that's at issue here, epistemic value. I guess I think that how inflationary one is a bit of a matter of degree, but at the very least, I'm against the following picture. What I think of as the most full-on inflationist picture of the value would say that in addition to I would think of this in terms of naturalness. I would say, in addition to fundamental properties of physics, there are fundamental notions of value. And that's part of the furniture of the value is part of the furniture of the world in the same sense in which charge and mass are part of the furniture of the world. That would be the most inflationist kind of value. And I'm not thinking of value in that way. In a bit of a preview, I'm thinking of value in a very externalist, naturalist way. Though I think what I say could accommodate that extreme kind of value.
Okay.
But you'll see in a bit what I do need to assume about value. But
Awesome.
I think not that.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So I want to concede I want to accept Dasgupta's challenge that a kind of realism that Lewis accepts and which I think is correct about naturalness requires a certain kind of realism about value where that means objectivity. Though as we've just seen, I don't want it to require this primitivism about the value. So here's Dasgupta's challenge. Then what could possibly explain the fact that this purely metaphysical posit, naturalness, this metaphysical doodad in the world, this primitive glow that surrounds some properties and not others, what gives it normative significance? I mean, what is it about it that magically attracts legitimate cognizing to itself? Merely saying there's this property and its naturalness, as I think Dasgupta rightly argues, doesn't explain how it could deserve being thought of as naturalness. What makes that this is a kind of a Lewisy phrase here. What makes the property of naturalness deserve its name? Really, as far as the metaphysics is concerned, all we're saying is that there's this glow that is it's a primitive property had by some properties and not others. Well, why should I care about that? I think that's a good challenge, and we should answer it. So, my colleague Jonathan Schaffer. So we've talked about this. I think this is a very important challenge for realist metaphysics. A bunch of, I'm sure, lots of people have been talking about this argument in the last few years. We have had a couple of meetings about it in a reading group we have at Rutgers a few years ago, and Jonathan pressed a certain line of response. So I'm going to describe this response as a Schafferian reply because Schaffer himself doesn't make it in exactly these terms. So it's in the spirit of what he says. So don't attribute this to him, but attribute whatever is good in it to him. I think this is best put in a dialogue. So the Schafferian leads and says, okay, you're asking me what the explanation is. Oh, sorry. I want to, before I get to that, Dasgupta is demanding an explanation for why naturalness has this epistemic value. You could think of that value in different ways. So I'm just going to pick one particular value statement and let that be the locus of our discussion from now on. And that is, scientists ought to aim for laws. And by that, I mean, scientists ought to aim to discover what the laws are according to the Humean reduction I was mentioning earlier. Scientists ought to be interested in discovering what the universally true generalizations are whose predicates stand for natural properties. So if it's true that F equals MA, that's the kind of thing they should be after. If it's true that Shmef equals Shmem, Shmei, where that's where we're having kind of gruified versions of force, mass, and acceleration, that's not something that scientists should be particularly looking at. So for short, scientists should aim for laws. So here is the Schafferian explanation for where that value comes from. The Schafferian says, what is the explanation for why science should aim for laws? That's just part of what I mean by should. So it should call to mind, if you've ever run into Strawson's account of the rationality of induction, Strawson says it's just part of what we mean by rational, that we should be inductivists rather than counter-inductivists and expect the future to be unlike the past. So to this, Dasgupta, I think, will say something like this: fine, you're free to mean whatever you want by the word should. So given what you mean by should, scientists should aim for laws. But relations are cheap. We could define another relation, shmud aim for, that scientists bear to shmlaws, not laws. Somebody else, like Schaffer, could make an analogous stipulation. What they mean by should aim for is shmud aim for. Okay, so he's basically saying, okay, you can define it that way, but what about if somebody else defines the word should in a different way? Now, before we go on here, this phrase relations are cheap is Dasgupta's signature move. It's the argumentative or dialectical move that he makes again and again in the paper. And he points out that whenever the realist tries to give an explanation and appeals to different kinds of concepts, like charge and mass or law of nature or naturalness, or what you should do, what you should believe, there's always ways of shmamiking, as I call it in my paper, those concepts, reinterpreting them in a weird conceptual scheme. And even naturalness, you can understand schmaturalness as in a kind of funny way, in an alternate conceptual scheme, and then reinterpret all the concepts in this web, like charge and mass and natural and should and law and cause. They're an interconnected web of concepts, and if you can imagine adjustments in one of them and then corresponding adjustments into them all, in them all. So schmaturalness rather than naturalness, and then redefining law in terms of schmatural properties, redefining should in terms of laws and so forth. And again, Dasgupta raises the challenge of what's so great about your concepts rather than these shmamiked alternatives. This is a good challenge, a good thing to grapple with. And it's good to remember that just because you've chosen one magical word like naturalness, that doesn't make the possibility of shmamiking the concept go away. It's still there. You can consider schmaturalness rather than naturalness. Okay. So the Schafferian, though, has a reply to this. And it's, who cares? I was asking the question, what scientists should aim for. I answered it. I said it was built into the what I mean by should, that scientists should aim for laws. And you just changed the subject. You said, well, there's this other word and it could mean this other thing. So what? Like if I gave my explanation of why scientists should aim for laws and you had said, oh yeah, well, 6 out of every 10 scientists prefer bubblegum to lollipops. That would, it just doesn't meet what I was saying. But in a narrow sense, what Dasgupta actually said, well, what I imagine Dasgupta saying, and he would say this, doesn't meet what the Schafferian was saying. Schafferian said, this is why you should aim for laws, and what Dasgupta said did not contradict that. So the Schafferian reply is drawing attention to the fact that Dasgupta's signature move does not directly impact. It's not directly relevant to the Schafferian explanation. And there's also kind of a little bit of an attitude that goes with it. It's just indifference to this other fact, this fact that Dasgupta keeps bringing up. So I think that that Jonathan was importantly right about something like this. First of all, I think he's certainly right that that Dasgupta's relations are cheap move is not directly relevant to the Schafferian reply. And I also think, and you'll have to wait for a bit, but I also think that at some point in the dialectic, we will need to employ something like the Schafferian indifference to changing the subject. However, I think in this particular case, it's not enough to reply as the Schafferian did, because I think that even though relations are cheap, that move and bringing up schmlaws and schmatulness and schmud, even though that isn't directly relevant, I think it is indirectly relevant, because I think it challenges the objectivity of the value that is defended in the Schafferian way. So I think the fact that we can imagine a group of people using should to mean schmud does challenge the objectivity of the obligation that the Schafferian was trying to defend. But to see that, I think we have to delve into the notion of objectivity. So that's what's next.
Can I ask a quick clarificatory question?
Yeah.
I understand that by this appeal to the Shamikt version of should, I mean, the Schafferian can respond, well, that doesn't mean you shouldn't,
Right.
or that says nothing about that. But instead of challenging the answer, you might see Dasgupta as challenging the question itself. It really doesn't, like, why is it even important to ask what should scientists do? You know, there's nothing special about should anyway. So, you know, we might as well be asking the other thing.
I think that's dead on. And in fact, I think that is in a similar spirit to what I want to say. What I want to say is that if there was nothing more to be said in defense of our meaning of should, then it wouldn't be an objective answer. It's and I would tie objective to there's nothing better about our conceptual scheme than one that used the term should to mean schmud. But what the Schafferian can say is that it is objective because objectivity is mind independence. What it is to be objective is for the fact to be not dependent on what we say or think, or even that we exist in certain ways. And if should means is defined in terms of naturalness in a certain way, there's no reason to think that it will be mind dependent. Even if we had decided to mean by should something else, it still would have been the case that we should have aimed at laws. That's kind of like the old, even if you had called cats birds, they still couldn't have flown because you used the word could have flown in counterfactual circumstances, the way to describe counterfactual circumstances using our actual linguistic conventions. So what's important to me is disagreeing with the idea that objectivity is mind independence. Now, and it's going to, as you'll see, it'll tie into the thought you were having. So now the notion of objectivity is a notoriously slippery notion. And a lot of people recognize that there are problems with the notion of objectivity being defined as mind independence. So, for example, facts about minds. I mean, it's an objective fact that there are thoughts, but if there weren't any people, there wouldn't be any thoughts. So now, the way people usually deal with this is that they'll hedge and they'll like build a little thing and like they'll say, well, to be objective is to be mind dependent unless the thing is about minds. But I mean, that's unsatisfying and also doesn't work because if you consider statements about minds, some of them may be objective and some may not. So you've lost the opportunity to make that distinction. So in fact, I think we need a completely different approach to objectivity. I mean, not that mind independence is not important. There might be a notion of objectivity for some maybe objectivity is a kind of philosophical term of art, and for some purposes, mind independence might be what's important. But I mean, one sign that it's totally on the wrong track is I think there are counterexamples in the other direction. So I think there are mind independent matters that are not objective. So here's a nice example from John Hawthorne, which I'm repurposing to make it be about objectivity. So so take an island, very small island in a deep ocean, and if you forget about the surface of the water, there's this big giant protrusion from the ocean floor. Now I'm taking it that's not a mountain. I mean, it doesn't matter much for my argument whether it is or it isn't, but I'm thinking it's not. And although you could run my argument on the assumption that it is, I think, because the way I'm thinking about it, it's part of our notion of mountain that that doesn't count. So our notion of mountain is something like a really big protrusion from the surface of the earth that extends a long way above into the air above sea level, above any water surface. If that's what it is to be a mountain, that thing would have still been a mountain had we used the word differently. I mean, that's just like cats wouldn't have been able to fly even if we used fly to mean walk. That I should have used that example in the first place. So that's mind independent. But it's not objective. I mean, if you imagine a big dispute, like I can imagine, like, you get into disputes like this in bars, you go, this is a nice example of Karen Bennett's. Like if you get this is maybe more for native English speakers, but like you have a drink and it's in a V-shaped glass, do you call it a martini? If it's made, does it have to be made of gin or vodka, or can it be made of some other kind of liqueur? It's just a conceptual question. It's just how the word martini works or how the word mountain works. But the question isn't about words. Like if you say that's a mountain, you're not talking about words. You're talking about the thing. So it's not mind independent. It's not about words. I'm thinking it's not objective, nevertheless. So I'll give you another example. This depends on what may not be an accurate semantics for aesthetic terms, but I think you can imagine there could be a group of people for whom aesthetic terms have the following semantics. Here's the idea. When you call like a flower or a mountain beautiful, you are attributing to it some particular physical property, like simplistically, has this kind of shape or that kind of shape or that kind of shape. The fact that you are attributing that particular physical property is a projection of your societies or your species or whatever, your aesthetic sense. So of course you could have easily had a different one and then you would have meant something different by beautiful. But in your language, the term beautiful just means this physical property. So we call a certain flower beautiful. Another species or another culture might not call that beautiful, but they use the term beautiful to mean something else. Okay, so I call a certain flower mountain beautiful. That's that fact, the fact I expressed. The flower is beautiful is mind independent, not about words. Definitely not objective. It's just a projection of my own conceptual scheme, my own species or culture's preferences or aesthetic sense. So I'm thinking that these examples point to the idea that we should have a quite different conception of objectivity that is actually metasemantic, a notion of objectivity where whether something is objective does not inhere in the proposition expressed by a sentence, but it's rather metalinguistic in a certain way. It has to do with what else we could have meant by the sentence. So it really inheres in the sentence, not in the proposition. So here's my conception of objectivity, or at least an important notion of objectivity. If a sentence has equally good alternatives, different things that you could have meant by the sentence that are just as good in a sense that I have to explain, under which the sentence has different truth values, then the sentence is not objective. So that is a mountain. If that's part of our language's conventions, that mountain means protrusion that's not mostly submerged, that's fine, but we could just as easily have meant something different by mountain. And the sentence would have expressed a different proposition and would have had a different truth value then. I'm thinking that that in itself makes the sentence, that is not a mountain. True, but not non-objective. And if I'm wrong about what the word mountain means, if the word actually, if that protrusion is a mountain, well, we could have used the term with a restriction so that it doesn't count as a mountain. So either way, also if the term is indeterminate between the two meanings, that would also be a case in which you would have a non-objective subject matter. But what's important to me is there can be cases where the language determinately works one way. So it doesn't have to be indeterminate, which of these candidate meanings are actually signified. The language might determinately mean one of them, but just it would have been fine to use one of the other ones. It's a conventional choice. Or maybe not purely conventional. Maybe the choice was in fact made because of some important fact about culture. Like not that like people just decided, let's let that be beautiful, but rather it comes from our shared history that we consider these shapes to be beautiful. Still, it's a projection of our culture and not an intrinsic fact in the world that these shapes stand out as beautiful to the exclusion of the shapes that would be considered beautiful by another linguistic community.
I have a question there.
Yeah, go.
Like the way you put it, it sounds like it has to do a lot with like sentences. So I wonder if the same could be said of like, I don't know, thoughts or attitudes.
Yeah.
I don't know what you have to say about it.
I can imagine an argument that it would be better to run all this on something more intermediate between sentences and meanings, like concepts or thoughts or something like that. It's got to be something that doesn't fully have its interpretation built in, but there still could be, I mean, concepts, you think of them as having some inferential role built into them, and that could be part of it. In fact, that's that is actually going to be relevant in just a bit. So I like that idea. Let's keep an eye on that, and I'd be interested if you think of further. I mean, like, I get that. Like, if you have, you can imagine another language which is really just, where there's a translation of our language. I mean, a language where there's translatable in some full, rich sense, and then the entities that are being, where we think of, it's the translation needs to preserve more than conceptual role. I mean, it's got to also preserve like what gets called beautiful in my example. But if it does, yeah, you're right. The locus of objectivity should be something in common to those two linguistic communities. So yeah, maybe not phonemes or bits of written types of written language. I think that's a good point.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, I was wondering whether this metasemantic view of objectivity doesn't presuppose anything like referent magnetism or something like that people like Dasgupta may reject in your account. Right,
good. I think it does, and it'll be explicitly presupposed in a bit. And then I think we do need at the very end to think about the dialectic here and whether some questions have been begged. And I want to return to that. I think it's an important question.
Okay, thanks.
So I have to say something about what equally good alternatives are, because for every sentence, I mean, meaning is conventional. So by, I have hands, I could have meant I have fins, or that snow is green. So I could have meant something different by I have hands that would have made it a false sentence. That doesn't make I have hands non-objective. So the alternatives have to, in some sense, have the same conceptual role. And this is what I started thinking about, Diego, when you were asking about whether there should be, it should be more about thoughts or something like, I was then thinking, well, maybe something like a concept, which has something about inferential role built in, but it can't fully build it in because it might be that some stuff that I want to consider varying that's relevant to the truth value, I want to consider some of that not to be part of the role played by the concept. So my picture is like, if a group of people, well, like, it is part of the inferential role. Let's assume that the way we use the term mountain, if it's all submerged or mostly submerged, it's not a mountain. So I don't want that to be part of the idea of the defining semantic role of the term mountain. But like, it's a term for like the kind of thing that's pretty big and it comes out of the earth. Like you can imagine a linguistic community that doesn't seem semantically alien. That's a phrase I want to use to get us onto the right idea here. Could there be a non-semantically alien community that used the term with this alternate meaning? And I'm thinking that we could recognize as being quite similar to us a linguistic community in which they counted the protrusion as being a mountain. So that's the kind of variation in meaning that I want to count as the meaning still doing the same job as the actual meaning. Whereas if the term mountain meant elephant, no, not doing the same job. It's a bit mushy. I don't have a good, I'm just going to just tell you now, I don't have a better definition of what that is. I'm sensing that the notion of objectivity is tied to some such notion, and that's and it would be good to clarify it more. But in any case, that's the notion I'm employing here: a notion of a doing the same job, or a notion of a semantically non-alien community, and I need that to state my theory. So there's that. That's a kind of internal constraint on what counts as an equally good meaning, but there's also a more external constraint, which is in terms of naturalness. So let's suppose it's true that there is some lithium on Mars, but that's because there's one atom of lithium there. And I don't want it to be a borderline case of being part of Mars, so make the atom right in the middle of Mars. And so it's definitely true that there's some lithium on Mars. Imagine a linguistic community that uses the term lithium to mean everything what we mean, to mean exactly what we mean by lithium, but not including that one atom of lithium. So it plays a very, very similar role to the semantic role played by lithium in our language. I don't think it can be disqualified as being an equally good alternative in the way that I would disqualify the alternative meaning of hand as meaning elephant. Okay, I have a hand. I want that to be objectively true. So it's irrelevant that we could have meant by hand elephant. I want it to be objectively true. It's intuitively objectively true that there's lithium on Mars. If somebody said there isn't any, they would just be flat out making a mistake. But there would be this tiny difference in the meaning of lithium we could make, which would make it false. So what I think that means is that just as good candidates has a metaphysical dimension, they can't be way less natural properties. They can't carve at the joints, much, much worse. The property of lithium minus, which is lithium except for that one bit taken, that one lithium atom removed from its extension, is a horribly unnatural, non-natural property. So objective means it wouldn't change its truth value so long as you vary the meaning in ways that don't all of a sudden start carving at the joints way worse, assigning much less natural properties, and you don't like change the subject by making the term mean something that doesn't do the same job. So that's the metasemantic account of objectivity, and I try to defend it and say it's important in this book I was referring to, Writing the Book of the World. And the core of what I want to say to Dasgupta depends on this conception of objectivity. Now, by the way, I think that now we have to confront the dialectical issue that was someone was just asking me about recently. Is there some sense in which we're begging the question here against Dasgupta? But there is an important sense in which this conception of objectivity is very friendly to what Dasgupta argues, because Dasgupta is arguing as if it matters that these other alternative meanings exist, should instead of should. And his argument, I think, presupposes some sort of metasemantic conception of objectivity. I mean, he's thinking, who cares about should if there's also shmud, and you can't say anything about what makes shmud better than should better than shmud. I'm thinking that he's the way of making his argument feel compelling is to bring in the metasemantic account of objectivity. Okay.
Can I ask a quick
yeah,
question?
Yeah, go.
So suppose you have a view according to which terms in natural language are massively polysemous and vague and context sensitive, so that there's no one-one relationship between terms and meanings.
Right.
And that's a view that many people hold. So suppose that's the truth. Then does it entail that objectivity is not a property of natural language sentences?
That seems right to me. Right, like the really radical contextualist conception. It's determinacy is negotiated on the fly in each linguistic interaction. It's not conventional. It's like a Chomskyan or what's his name, Charles Taylor, or anyway, I know the view you're talking about, or like relevance theory or something like that.
Or even vagueness. I mean, you don't have to go the contextualist way. You can say, well, look, most terms in natural language are vague, so you will have.
I see. Well, but I think that's okay because I mean my alternative candidates are like a superset of the precisifications, and the presence of a vague term doesn't make the sentence unobjective if all of the precisifications and all the other candidates, which are determinately not meant but are nevertheless could have been meant in non-alien societies, if the truth value remains constant. Like that's my, like hand, like I agree, hand is non-vague, but this isn't a borderline case. And even if it weren't a borderline, but the border could have been a little different in the group, the linguistic community could have been, I mean, even that would be non-objective. Like if we're given our language's range of the precisifications, we're well with super true, but if we'd been a little different, it would have been wouldn't have been, or maybe even super false. That would undermine objectivity, but the hand case I'm thinking is not like that. So it's okay if the term, but if the vagueness is massive, then I think I'm in trouble because I can't use conventional meaning in the way that I am to draw a line around the candidates. So, but intuitively on one of these, well, it would depend on the view, but intuitively on a more radical, there should be still something which we can define, which plays the same role. I mean, something like, you know, if you're a speaker of our language, and then in a particular context, you say something which asserts a certain proposition, we can imagine groups of people who, in that context, asserted, like I said, there's a hand, and somebody else said there's an elephant, that they would be alien. If I say, that's a mountain, and I express a certain proposition, and maybe in different contexts, I would express pretty different propositions, but in this context, if you imagine a bunch of people who use that same form of sounds to express a proposition that is true, and it's a proposition that is true in all and only the possible worlds in which the thing denoted, actually, I don't know if these people are against denotation. Let's assume they're not. The thing denoted is, so it's all about the predicate, not about the referent, but I realize it could be both. Anyway, the modal extent of the property is quite different, so that it includes things that are submerged. If we can say that community plus context is not alien, then maybe I've got the materials I need to draw a line around an appropriate class of alternatives. Then there's the question of what the locus is. Maybe it's the set of sounds together with the context, the ordered pair of the sound and the context. Maybe that would be my sentence or sentence-like thing. I mean, it feels fraught. It feels like there's a question about whether that really works. I hear you. I think it's. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's much harder. I certainly was presupposing a view on which there's a lot more conventionally in place than is in place on those kinds of views, and I had never thought at all about how deep that presupposition runs. I see that it might well run pretty deep. I like that point.
Thanks.
Thank you. But can we take like a really brief, like 5-minute break? Is that possible at the roughly halfway point? That'd be all right with people, or even 2 minutes.
Yeah, it's fine. I
Okay.
think we can take a 5-minute.
I just need 2, though I'm happy with 5, but whatever.
Okay,
I'll
then
be
3. Let's, yeah. Okay.
Great. By the way, when is the talk supposed to be done? How much time do we have left?
I think we have like half an hour more of
Okay.
just presentation, and then 20 minutes for questions.
Okay. So let me know. Should I restart now, or should we? Are
Sure.
people still coming back? Okay. Okay. Let's see. So let's get back to the Schafferian reply. Are my slides still visible?
No.
Okay, let me reshare. Okay, does everyone have the Schafferian reply? Great.
Thanks.
So here in condensed form was that dialogue between the Schafferian and Dasgupta. So the Schafferian says, you asked me why science should aim for laws. It's part of what I mean by should. Dasgupta says, yeah, but it's part of meaning, an alternate meaning of should, that scientists schmould aim for schmlaws. Schafferian, so what? That's not directly relevant. So given the meta-semantic conception of objectivity, that last claim isn't so clearly right. It's not directly relevant because it doesn't directly contradict the explanation of the obligation to aim for laws, but it is challenging the objectivity because it's an alternative meaning for should, and and under that meaning, the sentence comes out false, and it's kind of pushing our objectivity buttons. I mean, in fact, the fact that we hear that raising the possibility of these alternate meanings as threatening to objectivity, I think is evidence that the meta-semantic account is on the right track. I mean, it feels we lose our confidence that we should be caring so much about the should when we point out that we could just have meant something a little different. But whether it really is whether we really do have a threat to objectivity depends, according to the meta-semantic account, on whether that alternate meaning for should is an equally good alternative. So if that meaning for should is like the meaning of elephant for hand, or like the meaning of lithium minus for lithium, then there is no threat to objectivity. Okay, so clearly that, well, I don't know about clearly, but I think the this alternate meaning schmud should not be disqualified from being an equally good alternative meaning in the way that meaning elephant by hand should be disqualified, because of the parallel inferential role it plays. I mean, what we're imagining naturalness, the word natural meaning something a little different, and then a corresponding difference in meaning throughout the web of interconnected nodes, conceptual nodes. And at least there's a kind of parallel amongst all those different possible meanings that suggests that from an internal point of view, there's nothing wrong with that alternative meaning. That's certainly how Dasgupta is thinking of it, I think. But I think that meaning is relevantly like lithium minus. So to get into that, I want to build a kind of toy externalist account of the value in question. So that is, I want to get into whether schmud is an equally good meaning to should. I got to get into what schmud and should are. I want to get into the metaphysics of the value in question, and then we can compare the value and its alternative and see if there's some if it's relevantly like the lithium case. Now, I'm not in a position to give like a plausible metaphysics of value. So I'm going to build a kind of toy theory. And the way this is supposed to work dialectically is you're supposed to see how my response to Dasgupta would go given the toy theory. And then you're supposed to think, well, a more realistic theory is going to be like the toy theory in the relevant respect. And so a similar response to mine could go through on a more realistic theory of what the value is. And we could think about the range of kinds of theories of which that would be true. Maybe there's some which this wouldn't work. So the account is going to be an externalist one. So the grounds, the metaphysics. So we're talking about a certain kind of value, but it's an epistemic value, not a moral value. And when we're asking after its metaphysics, we're actually asking after its ground, or what in the world makes it true, or what would be the metaphysical analysis of statements of value of this sort. And the basic idea is, I mean, it's broadly externalist. The views of this sort say that at least in a big important dimension of certain kinds of value have to do with our environment and our connection to our environment. And the toy just says pretty flat-footedly, the feature of the world, the broad feature of our environment that makes the case that scientists ought to aim for laws is basically that there are lots of laws. In our world, there are many true, simple generalizations that are cast in terms of natural properties. Maybe not the things that we think are laws, but there are, in fact, lots of laws. The world is a simple place when simplicity is evaluated in terms of natural properties. So the spirit of the, so just for short, for a slogan, the ground of the obligation to aim for laws is that nature is congenial. So this is a variation on the answer to why it's reasonable to believe that the future is like the past. Well, because we live in a world where the future, by and large, does resemble the past. So this might seem a little alien, like how could that be a reason for it to be obligatory to believe it? That just seems like it's that's just saying beliefs and laws are true or something like that. First of all, it doesn't require that in order for scientists to have well-justified beliefs, they be correct. They could be wrong about what the laws are. But the spirit of this is anti-Cartesian. So the idea is that the Cartesian product of showing purely from the inside that our beliefs are likely to correspond to the external world is hopeless, and that whether a person's beliefs are justified or have these various terms of epistemic appraisal are in part claims about the world and our relationship to it. And they may be more sophisticated versions of this theory, they may hold in partially because of facts about our evolutionary history, and the fact that we evolved certain mechanisms or general strategies for forming beliefs that were suited to the environment, and maybe they were selected for because they were suited to the environment. This is the kind of thing that externalists about epistemic values will say actually makes it be the case that it is right to form beliefs with these methods and not those other methods. So the values themselves are connected to facts that that make them truth conducive. And this just is a feature of externalism about epistemic value. I think to be likely to be correct, a lot more has to be said. For one thing, I think that something has to be said about the internal states also. I wouldn't want to be a kind of pure externalist. I think something about the internal states of scientists are important too. But let's keep the toy as simple as possible. What's important about it is that it defines should in terms of natural properties, because laws are defined in terms of natural properties. What makes scientists obligated to aim for laws is that the world, in fact, has lots of regularities in the natural properties. Other accounts, which were less toy, but still externalist enough to define the obligation in terms of some kinds of features of the world that are natural features, can say similar things to what I'm about to say.
Can I ask a
Yes.
Can I ask a quick question? I was just curious about like contextualist accounts of should. And yeah, if this account was going to exclude those, or if those could also be accommodated.
That's another good question. Another one I haven't properly confronted. Okay, so let's see if I can get this out properly. I had worried about something slightly different. What about a view which says that epistemic values are not objective in a certain sense? Like, if you imagine a bunch of people who were just indifferent to the truth, or imagine a bunch of people that were indifferent to morality. One kind of meta-ethicist or meta-epistemologist is going to say, well, that person isn't objectively screwing up. So there's a kind like, if like to the question, why be moral? If there's no, if like you're not missing out on the objective structure of things, if you just are indifferent to these things, that's one kind of view. And that, I think, is not a kind of view that I necessarily have to reject. What I have to object to, and let's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, is the idea that given that you are accepting the epistemic norms at all, I don't want there to be failure of objectivity on exactly how you have to accept them. So my idea is that there are dimensions of objectivity, and I want there to be I want an aim to I want aiming at schmlaws to be objectively wrong on one dimension of objectivity, but I want to leave open that that doesn't mean that values at all are objectively mandatory to recognize. And I'm thinking that's analogous to the contextualist, because I'm thinking there's a kind of parameter that contextualists set in different ways, like an Lewisian contextualism, where the standards are being set. And I don't think that any settings of that parameter are any better than any others. But then there's, I think, another parameter which is orthogonal to the first, where variation on that parameter corresponds to norms which privilege laws as opposed to schmlaws, as opposed to some other weird conceptual scheme. That parameter, I'm thinking, is an objective one, and one setting of it is the best. I realize that's pretty abstract, and I feel like I would need to say a bit more to make that better. That might make a little more sense once I say a little more about the toy theory, but I would like it. So maybe a simpler answer is just, at least if you fix a context, I want there to be I don't want it to be, I want it to be objectively correct that you ought to aim for schmlaws rather than laws, holding fixed to context.
Awesome, thanks.
I think that's another thing to keep in mind. And maybe that could be something we could return to in the Q&A. I think it's a good question. I'd like to think about it more myself. Okay, let's consider this dialogue between me and Dasgupta. So this is like the Schäferian. So except, sorry, this is another dialogue like the dialogue between the Schäferian and Dasgupta, except it starts differently because it's me. I don't give the Schäferian answer. I say, why should we aim for laws? Because nature is congenial. So I'm thinking, what obligation is such and such where that involves congeniality. So it's not just that we've decided to mean something. It's not a direct connection. I mean, it's akin to Schäfer. In some sense, it is built into what should is, that it's that we should aim for laws, but it's built into it in a naturalist, externalist metaphysics of value, which involves certain kinds of natural properties. And if Dasgupta now says relations are cheap, we can define a relation Schmud aim for, which scientists spare to laws in virtue of the fact that nature is schmengenial instead of congenial. That is, nature has many schmlaws. Okay, that's how that's how Dasgupta's argument would go. And I would say, first of all, I would make the Schäferian reply. I would point out that's not directly relevant because I was giving an explanation of why we are obligated, and that doesn't address that at all. But now I also think it's objective, and we should face the concern that that undermines the objectivity of what I said. But to that, I have a reply also. I'll say, no, it's not even indirectly relevant. It doesn't render the obligation to aim for laws non-objective, because Schmud is much less natural than should. Should is understood in terms of the objective structure of the world. It is congenial for groups of people who aim at simple generalizations in the natural properties. And just a sidebar here, I mean, I would really want to understand this a little differently. I would want to understand the epistemology in Bayesian terms, and I would want to understand the relevant value predicate as a valuation of prior probability distributions. And my picture is that rational prior probability distributions are biased in certain ways towards simple generalizations in the natural properties, so that if you condition them on experience, the regularities in the natural properties will go up, and the ones in the unnatural properties won't, or not as much. But in any case, the picture is the value notion is understood in terms of these features of the external world that are understood in terms of natural properties. And if you shmamik them, that's like changing lithium to lithium minus. It's taking a property which is a pretty reasonably natural property and replacing it with a much less natural property based on the notion of schmlaws, schmarge, and schmass, and schmatralness. So it's not just as good a meaning. It's a much less natural meaning. And so it's no more undermines objectivity of the obligation to aim for laws than the existence, than the fact that we could have meant by lithium minus undermines the objectivity that there's lithium there. So that's my response, and I want to end by just making a few clarifying remarks about it, and then we're done. So first of all, Dasgupta's relations are cheap move feels threatening. As a realist, you think this is an important thing to aim for laws, and you feel vaguely threatened when you're pointing out that there's all these other conceptual schemes. You could build it all the way I'm trying to build this interconnected node, but based on a rotten core. What do I say about that? The metasemantic account of objectivity explains why it is threatening, or why it's prima facie threatening, but because it explains that alternate meanings can threaten objectivity, but it explains the boundaries on that. It explains when alternate meanings do and when they don't threaten objectivity. And it shows that objectivity here is not threatened. Second point, the Schafferian move is still needed because we still do need to say, yeah, we should aim, we still need to concede. We should aim for schmlaws. That's true. So what? What we cared about, the question was what we should aim for. I mean, you shouldn't just get freaked out because different sounding claims can come out true from what you're saying. If you mean something different by the words, you got to be able to point out, so what? That's not the question. The question is what you should aim for and whether that is objective. The dialectic could iterate again. Dasgupta might point out that it's not schmobjective, that we should aim for laws. Because when schmobjectivity is understood in terms of schmatral properties, there aren't equally schmatral alternatives to what you can mean. But it's not directly relevant because it's changing the subject, and it doesn't threaten the objectivity of value. Not only is it objective that we should aim for laws, it's objectively objective. The fact that it's not schmobjective isn't an equally good alternative to the statement that it's objective. Last thing, and this is relevant to a question that was asked earlier, this is what I'm making is an essentially defensive response to Dasgupta. So I'm not trying to convince him that you should believe in objective natural properties. I'm just assuming that. I'm not even trying to convince him that the theory of objectivity that I'm offering is correct. Though I think a lot of it, I think he should be, given the way he's reasoned about objectivity, he should at least be open to its metasemantic aspect. And I think just looking at cases like the lithium case shows that it just doesn't matter if you vary a meaning to something wildly unnatural. That doesn't threaten objectivity. But even so, I'm not trying to convince. The dialectic here I'm thinking is like that with external world skeptics. So this is a kind of familiar point. You encounter the skeptic, there's just no way you can convince the skeptic that the external world exists, because every time you say something, the skeptic's going to say, yeah, but I don't think that's compatible with what I think, because I think I'm dreaming it all, or something like that. The convincing a skeptic maybe is just going to be an extremely hard thing to do, but remaining unconvinced by a skeptic is non-trivial, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to provide a point of view which feels right by realist lights. I'm thinking it should be recognizable as the mindset one had all along if one was open to realism about natural kinds. And from that mindset show that Dasgupta's arguments don't undermine it. Dasgupta's arguments can be resisted from that mindset. Because when a good skeptic is threatening even from your point of view, even from the non-skeptic's point of view, and Dasgupta's skepticism is playing that role. Dasgupta is a good skeptic because Dasgupta was saying things that really did feel threatening, and it was not obvious how to reply to it. So I'm thinking that dialectically, this is a successful reply to Dasgupta, even though it contains things that he himself, as an anti-realist about all this, would not accept. Okay, that's all I have planned.
Thank you very much, Professor Seidel, for your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can have an electronic round of applause. Thanks. Now, we do have a queue for questions. So let us start. Jaime, puedes empezar tú.
Creo que había otra gente que estaba apuntándose o no.
No, tú vas primero, tú estás primero. Más bien, los que tengan preguntas, recuerden, escríbanme a mí y yo los pongo en el orden de la lista.
Okay.
Dale, Jaime.
Thank you so much, Ted, for the talk. I have a question about, this is a very rough idea I have, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about this idea of naturalness relative to a conceptual scheme or something like that. Mm-hmm. Because it seems like there might be some kind of regress at some point. Because if you say like, okay, there's this distinction and then somebody else says, no, that's only natural relative to this concept or something like that, then it seems like at some point they will have to appeal to a similar distinction within the conceptual framework. So I was wondering whether you have thought of any kind of regress arguments in the case of people who want to make the distinction between natural and non-natural conceptual scheme.
Are you thinking that like someone like Dasgupta, who thinks that naturalness is relative to conceptual scheme? Okay, so let me think about this. It's interesting because at first I'm thinking no, because he can just have this relation between conceptual schemes and properties. This property is natural relative to that conceptual scheme. And I can imagine somebody saying, well, what a conceptual scheme really is in the first instance finite, a finite object, because we say a bunch of things, like we in fact in the past have treated things that are the same color as similar, and things that are the same gruller, that's like a cooked up thing, as not being similar. And so like you think, well, the right way to project from those cases so far, go on doing the same thing in like this Wittgensteinian sense, is to continue to count things of the same color as being similar. And if another conceptual scheme so far has been counting GRU things as being alike, then we will want to say in their conceptual scheme, that's still going to be true for the future. But like, what if you're in from one conceptual scheme, you will project this other conceptual scheme's behavior into the future in one way, but from another conceptual scheme, you'll project them differently. So that exactly what the conceptual scheme is now considered as an infinitary object, like the projection going forward of the initial segment that the language speakers have actually enacted. That might itself be relative to conceptual scheme.
Because I was thinking that maybe in that projection there will be a need for some kind of more natural ways of projecting or something.
Yeah, right.
Like, but you're saying that maybe not, right?
Well, no. I mean, I was thinking this was your argument that
okay.
What you consider this community's conceptual scheme to be at all depends on your conceptual scheme.
Okay.
But I mean, maybe we can make a distinction between conceptual schemes in the abstract and conceptual schemes in the concrete. And if you just consider a conceptual scheme just to be a relation between, well, if you consider a conceptual scheme just to be a set of judgments about what is natural and what isn't, what properties are natural and what isn't. So it's not a flesh and blood community, but it's rather just an infinite, properties conceived as infinite objects, and then just answers yes or no. That property is natural. No, that one isn't. That there could be multiple conceptual schemes of that sort, and that wouldn't be any kind of regress. And then the regress would only come when we want to somehow associate those with language communities. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine someone like Dasgupta would want to say, yeah, maybe there is something kind of funky there. You're going to want to say, we would say that's our conceptual scheme, but they would say it's not, and there's no right answer. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But that was the kind of argument I was imagining.
I like that.
Yeah,
that's cool. I have to think about that more. I don't know about that.
Thanks.
Good. Luego tenemos a Gaby.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Ted, for your amazing talk. I just had one, I think it's just a clarificatory question for myself. There was this thing I didn't understand in the end. When you're replying to Dasgupta, and you're imagining his response appealing to this idea of, congeniality, but with an SH in the beginning. I will not even try to to say that one.
I probably pronounce it differently every time I say it. So
yeah, so this other version, I didn't quite get why does he have to appeal to that sort of thing? Because in a sense, if your argument using this reliabilist or externalist in general view appeals to truth conductiveness or something like that, or something that generates that sort of thing, that is something they have. Like, it's something that you can get. Truth is something you can get under any sort of conceptual scheme. So in a way, he doesn't have to appeal to his own version of congeniality, or he could just say, look, I have exactly the same thing you have. It just maps on differently to this thing. So I didn't understand why he has to appeal to that. He can say,
Okay,
I
good.
generate the same sort of, that was
Good. I was thinking that the congeniality is more, it's narrower than just reliability. I mean, in our world, so let's let schmaturalness correspond to some bizarre carving, and so this is something. So Goodman. So back to Goodman and Grew and Bleed. And so Goodman says Grew is green and first observed before a certain time, or blue and not first observed before that time. And Bleen is like the dual of that, blue and first observed before then, or green and not. And you might think, well, if you used Grew and Bleen, you couldn't have any laws. You couldn't have any true generalizations, because it isn't true that all emeralds are green, because some of them are sorry, it isn't all emeralds are green, but it isn't true that they're all Grew, because the ones that aren't first observed before the time aren't Grew, because they're green, not blue. And Goodman said, well, emeralds are all Grew. Emeralds are things that are emeralds before the time, or sapphires after. And all emeralds are Grew. And so the general point is, you can get true generalizations stated with really weird concepts, as long as you do weird things to the antecedent and consequent. And more generally, there's this like argument in this literature. This is the Putnam permutation argument. If you take the entire world, the domain of all the objects, just consider some random permutation of that domain. So some one-to-one function from the domain onto itself, and take any predicates of ours and take all of our predicates and reinterpret them under the permutation. Then any sentence of ours is going to be true under the permutation. So you'll have like really, really bizarre meanings for predicates, but all F's or G's will still be true if it was true under our meanings. And so if we're just looking at what tends to be true, that doesn't distinguish between the laws and the schmlaws. If the schmlaws are like all emeralds are Grew, all emeralds are Grew, that's different. That's just false. And so there'd be kind of like a more objective way of excluding that. You said, well, you should be accepting truths, but all emeralds are Grew is true, and the schmlaws are true. And so Dasgupta, I wanted to privilege the search for laws over the search for schmlaws, even though they're both true. And so that's why I needed to consider an alternative meaning of laws, and say, yes, if you say that's what it is to be obligated to search for something, fine, but there's this other notion of obligation nearby, to which I then say, well, that's not just as good a notion. Is that meeting the concern you had?
Yeah, I think more or less. I mean, I have to think a bit more about this. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Good.
Okay, Pairo.
Hi, Ted. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm interested in the consequences of the metasemantical definition of objectivity, that the consequences that could appear in, for instance, modal disagreements, because we could imagine modal disagreements where there are equally good candidates for the term good, and in that sense, it's a faultless disagreement. So there's not really someone mistaken, and I think that it would follow from this definition of objectivity that we should abandon any kind of naturalist approach to the meaning of moral terms, and also that we should reduce moral sentences to, like, we should accept that there's no objectivity there. So does it follow that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually thought about this. I'm not going to be able to get the details of everything I thought about this right earlier, but I did think about some of how what I'm saying connects to, actually, I thought more about moral twin earth than I did about faultless disagreement. So maybe it's not exactly the same issue. Actually, I have a written version of this on my website that you could find, but now thinking about it more, maybe it doesn't directly, what I say in this note doesn't directly fit with what you're saying. So you have in mind a case which there's a faultless disagreement but about something moral, not like an aesthetic judgment.
So I think that the projects for naturalist reduction for moral terms is more like a widespread than in case of aesthetic sentences.
Right. I like those kinds of views, and I was thinking, I mean, here's my picture. First of all, a view of that sort does not, it might be that there are around the edges some failures of objectivity. So like if moral rightness is some kind of property that has its origins in our evolutionary pasts, let's say, or is something having to do with a social contract, or it has something to do, like in Railton, with certain features that in some robust causal sense lead to flourishings of society, or things like that. A view of that sort might not yield a clear verdict in every particular case. And I was thinking that realism of that sort is compatible with acknowledging that there's some failures of objectivity, because there's some sort of I think it goes along with the following picture, that maybe in physics there's always going to be a single correct theory, but as you go higher up in the special sciences, there isn't always a uniquely correct way to theorize a domain. There might be different ways about thinking about what how to carve up the biological world. Maybe they all share some kind of foliation of animals into broad kingdoms or something like that, but then there's some room for understanding species in different ways, or in the social realm, there might be different ways of theorizing the domain, although maybe all agree in some things. And I was imagining that even if you're a realist and your conception of moral value is tied to some causal structure in a high level domain, there could be room for sort of fuzziness there, or room for different equally good ways to theorize. But I was thinking that the approach I was taking to value in the moral domain would still allow for there to be some objectivity, just not perfect or high res objectivity. Maybe not every individual case there's always an objective answer as to what you morally ought to do, but it's compatible with that there is a lot of objectivity nevertheless. I was also thinking that, and this was the thing that I was struggling to articulate earlier in response to an earlier question, where I was talking about dimensions of objectivity. It might be that, here's a picture. Let's suppose that there is I don't know, utilitarian rightness and deontic rightness and, you know, I don't know, Rossian rightness or something, a bunch of different kinds of rightness. And there's like 3 of them, and they're really quite different from each other. They correspond to different strands in our moral thought, so they don't, none of them really uniquely fit better with how we ordinarily talk about rightness than the others. I'm assuming this isn't really true, but you know, we get pulled in different directions. That can, maybe none of them, sort of from a naturalistic point of view, does a much better job than the other in playing a role in some higher level science of humans or something like that. I can imagine a certain kind of, I guess you think of it as a kind of moral anti-realism, is saying no one of these is better than the others at being morality. There's just like, you know, Rawlsian morality, Kantian morality, and Millian morality, and so on. But it might be that they're all objectively privileged as opposed to certain other things we could cook up, certain other evaluations of conduct, and certainly more objectively privileged than the result of taking one of them and just tweaking it a little bit in the way that I tweaked lithium to get lithium minus. And I'm thinking that there isn't a straight answer as to whether morality is objective. It's sort of like, if you're being Kantian, it's objective that this is how you should act rather than not like that. And if you're being utilitarian, you should act like this and not like that. But should you really be utilitarian rather than Kantian? Maybe there's no answer. I mean, I'm thinking what I'm doing is permits both attitudes. It permits both views. Both a view that there is just plain old objectivity, although it allows some cases of failures of objectivity, but maybe deep failures of objectivity, but not along just any old dimension, so that you could just turn Rawlsian rightness into Rawlsian rightness minus.
Perfect. Thanks so much. It resembles a bit of the, so if we have a moral contextualism or whatever, once we fix the context, then we could bring objective solution. But
yeah, that's a good way of, right, exactly. It fits exactly into the, right. And it could be contextualist. It could be like, you could think of it as a linguistic context, but it could be just some wouldn't have to be linguistically realized. It could be, it's just, that's the way the facts are. There isn't any one correct morality.
I see the picture. Thanks so much.
Okay, tenemos a Nuri.
Yeah, I had a question. I think it's related to Pyros. So I was struggling to understand still the difference between objective and non-objective expressions. And I guess I understand the intuition of how lithium minus doesn't make sense, in the same way that, I don't know, like different languages have different words for hand. Like some people have the same word for the hand and the fingers and the arm. And some languages only have and some languages, have like, I don't know, different variations of those kinds of expressions. And that seems perfectly, like, they're equally correct. Nothing will hinge on those. But I'm struggling as to, like, for somebody who isn't already committed to saying, like, yeah, lithium minus, and I know, like you said, that hedge about the skeptic, not trying to convince the skeptic, but I was wondering if there's something about, like, the way those words are introduced, like the way the word for lithium is introduced.
Good.
And yeah, like kind of scientific words seem to have different conditions of being introduced into the community than these other words, in which it would make a big difference if you said lithium minus or something like that. So yeah, I had a question.
That's a good question. So, okay, let me try a bit to make the naturalness constraint on objectivity seem sensible, even though, so I'll be more of a trying to convince for a bit. So I was thinking of the lithium minus case as quite different. Maybe to make it even sharper, let's imagine a meaning for lithium which has exactly the same extension as lithium, but in the actual world. But if we think of meanings as intentions, it has different extensions, very slightly different extensions at one possible world. So like in the world where Mars is just a little bit displaced, that one bit of lithium, that one atom of lithium wouldn't count in the extension of this other property. So they have exactly the same extension. Lithium and lithium minus have the same extension, slightly different intention. And I was thinking that there's just a fact of the matter that even though there's a fact of the matter that if Mars had been a little displaced just that exact amount, it would have still had lithium. So I'm thinking that our term lithium determinately means lithium and not lithium minus. And I'm thinking that that connects with this kind of thought. We're using the word lithium for a certain kind of stuff. And that same stuff would have been there if Mars had been slightly displaced. Lithium minus isn't a name for a kind of stuff because you don't, that bit in the middle of the center just is the same kind of stuff as what's elsewhere. So that I think connects with your thought that for natural kind, some kind of terms, there may be something, we may be more, it may be part of our usage of those terms that we're more inclined to defer to the world, so to speak, in determining their extensions. So like for a word like hand, or other words that play that similar conceptual role, we don't just like kind of vaguely point there and then say, and things like that. Because there's lots of things like that. There's the hand, there's part of a hand, there's an arm, and none of those are any better meanings than any of the rest. Whereas like lithium, if you point in the scientific way, like you say, well, it's the kind of substance that's in this sample, then there really is just kind of one thing you're pointing to. So I'm thinking this is a bit of a matter of degree, because I think if you imagine an extension for hand, an intension for the English word hand, which would be exactly like ours, except that in one possible world, a world in which I recited exactly every world in which I recite the first 100 digits of pi, this is not in the extension of hand. And I'm thinking that just well, I think it determinately is not what we mean by hand. I'm thinking that if we imagined a group of people that did mean that by hand, they would be really bizarre. So not like groups of people which would use the same word for hands, what we call hands and fingers and arms. Thinking that's a perfectly reasonable alternate conceptual scheme. But the one which used the term hand for this really weird property, I was thinking of that differently. That may be, maybe that's where you're that's not seeming right to you.
No, yeah, that makes sense. I guess I was wondering, so how far somebody could just say like, well, maybe there could be a people that connect in their conceptual scheme, like those kind, but that already sounds like the skeptic kind of pushing back. So yeah.
I don't want to cut off discussions of that sort just by saying I'm not trying to convince skeptics. I hereby make all such challenges welcome in this discussion. Let me throw one little complicating thing in the mix. Actually, was it you that brought up reference? Someone brought up reference magnetism. I mean, I think that naturalness is also part of just the metaphysics of what in fact attaches words to meanings. Because I think part of the reason why we determinately mean by the word hands and not this weird property hand minus is that that's a much less natural property. I mean, we never explicitly said here's a constraint on what I mean by hand. That kind of thing is a hand, but also modal sentences like if I had recited the first million digits of pi, I would still this still would have counted I would have still had a hand. Like we don't utter those kinds of sentences to constrain the meaning. Nevertheless, I think it does get constrained. It determinately doesn't mean that. I would say that's also, so therefore it's a little tricky for me to make my argument, because I'm actually not sure that it would be even possible for a group of people to mean that property by hand. But I guess if they made a weird stipulation, like stipulated that counterfactual is true, maybe that would have made it the case that they meant that by hand. I'm not sure.
Okay, we have our final question. Pero antes, recuerden los asistentes que vamos a sortear un libro de nuestro invitado de hoy, así que quédense sintonizados después de que termine la respuesta del expositor. Ahora sí, Edward.
Okay. So Ted, I had a question about like the strength and the scope of this joint carving epistemic requirement that you defended. So suppose some sort of resilient or neutral monism is true, and there is a stock of fundamental properties whose deep nature we cannot know. So there is no quidistic knowledge or anything like that.
Okay.
So do you think there is a sense in which we cannot fully meet this epistemic joint carving requirement, if that's true?
So I do want, so a wrinkle in all this is that, so that we can make a distinction between perfectly natural properties, which are the most fundamental properties of physics, let's say, maybe some stuff from logic, and properties that are more or less natural. And there's a real question in this vicinity about how to understand this degree of naturalness.
Right.
So, but let's spot me that for these purposes. So I do want to say that it's not as if we ought only to be speaking the language of physics. I want to say that, for example, if we're thinking about the realm of the social, we should be thinking in terms of monetary systems, and we should, for every area of inquiry that we take on, we should be thinking about the appropriate properties at that level. So we should be thinking about money rather than shmoney. We should be thinking about agriculture rather than schmagriculture, and so on. But even in the case of physics, the challenge, the challenge is most acute there, because that's the case in which people say we don't really know the natures of the fundamental properties.
Right.
We might still refer to them, though.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that we're getting the right kind of, our conceptual scheme gets the check mark that I want, the good appraisal that I want to give, provided just that we refer to the natural properties, even if, maybe if there was some beings that could somehow directly grasp those properties, that maybe I would be committed to saying that they're doing a little better than we are.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that might be a kind of consequence. I'm against this kind of view, and I think that we, referring to them is as much as we ever know in any case. So I don't know what referring to them, and then like maybe knowing some theories that contain those terms. That feels to me like that's knowing in the strongest sense that we would ever have. But that's a dispute that people have, and
Right.
and I see that if one didn't have that view, maybe there's a kind of tragedy where there's a kind of ideal we could never live up to.
Right.
But we could still have something pretty good.
Good. Okay. Thanks.